Good afternoon. It is an absolute delight to be here with you today. I've been asked to bring a philosophical viewpoint regarding the task of describing the nature of God, to consider why it matters, and reflect upon what descriptions of God say about ourselves as humans. What are we trying to accomplish when we assign God various attributes? Even more fundamental, what do we even mean when we say the word God? These are questions I have continually been asking in my adult life as I've deconstructed the theological underpinnings of my upbringing and as I walk through such questions with my college students. So I'm going to present to you the views of a wide assortment of philosophers who have entertained these concerns, but this is also indicative of my own journey of faith. I share with you some of the ideas that I have found challenging and compelling as I have pondered these questions. Assigning attributes to God is undergirded by a more fundamental question of what we mean by the very concept of God, which philosopher Peter Rollins has suggested we can place into four broad buckets: God as a super being, God as beyond being, God as the ground of being, and God as an event. To begin, many of us in this so-called Western and predominantly Christian-influenced environment, if we reflect on what we were taught as children or through different popular cultural images of the divine, we were trained to think of God as a being or a person, and not just any being, but as a super being. In the 11th century, philosopher Anselm put it in a rather abstract but pointed way that God is defined as that which nothing greater can be conceived, end quote. God is the greatest being of all beings, the one being to rule them all, possessing all the best attributes. There is something possibly comforting about this, something appealing to this account of God. The super being God is out there somewhere, can be described, can be personally known, can be related to. This is a God that I can pray to, a God who is in charge of everything and can protect me. However, this account of God has some drawbacks. Most significantly, the super being God is often a way of legitimizing our own thinking and assumptions about the world. The super being God usually functions to reinforce the values of society. And this is just as true of the authors of sacred texts as it is of us. The authors of the Bible describe God as king, master, Lord, shepherd, because these were the social categories they had at their disposal. Hence, for many of us in the so-called West, where wealth accumulation, exhaustive knowledge, obeying the rules, and power are conceived as important social capital, the super being God is often imagined as a big version of Santa Claus. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows when you've been bad or good. And if you want anything, just ask him and God will give you whatever you want. Given the human penchant to describe God in our image, the 19th century German theologian Ludwig Feuerbach concluded that God doesn't exist, but is simply a projection. The concept God is simply humans compiling an ideal image of all the attributes that we'd like to have. God is super smart. God is super strong. God is super kind, at least to me, and so on. God is simply a placeholder for society's ideals. Freud would later describe this as a form of wish fulfillment. Now, Feuerbach was an atheist, but his critique was intended to be a compliment insofar that he believed religion had imagined a God of love and goodness which had moved societies into having these same types of values. There is certainly some truth to this, but perhaps that is overly optimistic, for there is no shortage of examples of human societies where God as a super being has simply functioned as a confirmation bias, or as a distorted justification of a people's prejudices, of their penchant for power or use of violence. Indeed, ever since Emperor Constantine claimed that it was a vision of the sign of the cross that led him to victory over his enemies in 312 CE, Western Christianity has conveniently imagined God as a military leader, a crusader, a colonizer. Consider, for example, Michelangelo's depiction of the creation of Adam, which I've seen, one of the most iconic images of Renaissance art. Here, God is depicted as a super being, as Sky Daddy, as an old white European man who creates the first human in his own image, also a white man. Michelangelo's creation of Adam was painted in the early 1500s, just as European colonialism was in full swing, and hence arguably functioned as a means to both establish and reinforce white supremacy. God was perceived as a white man who defended the white man's projects. Beginning with the papal bull Inter Caetera in 1493, directly after Columbus's first voyage, Christians invented a legal theory now known as the doctrine of discovery, claiming that God, the ruler of the earth, conferred upon Christians the task of possessing the entire world, and thus it was a Christian's divine right to colonize all land and enslave anyone that got in their way. This theory has in fact been cited several times as legal precedent in America's Supreme Court. Likewise, the Puritan Cotton Mather and others would imagine God as a capitalist who profited from his slaves in order to justify slavery. In 2021, the survey organization PRRI asked respondents if they believe that, quote, God intended America to be a promised land for European Christians, end quote. 50% of white evangelicals and 30% of all respondents said yes. In other words, about 1/3 of all American adults believe in a God that justifies violence, believe in a God that justifies land theft and ethnic cleansing. For those in the position of power and privilege, appeals to God as super being often function as a tool to maintain and expand that power and privilege. It was the great philosopher Bob Dylan who summarized it best in 1964 when he pointed out that every nation that commits violence does so, quote, with guns in their hands and God on their side, end quote. For centuries, however, mystical theologians and philosophers have rejected this God depicted in anthropomorphic terms. Sky Daddy God is a caricature, a distortion, an idol. The mystical tradition speaks of a God not as a being, but as beyond being and beyond all human categories. Philosophers have long understood that the problem of describing God is first a problem of language. Many of us are trained to think of language as a referential tool, what is called the correspondence theory. That is, the term I use refer to or function as placeholders for something in the physical world. When I say cup, I am pointing to a cup in the physical world. When I say kiwi, I refer to a small fruit with a bright green flesh and black seeds, but I could be referring to a flightless bird or somebody from New Zealand. Look up the word run in the dictionary. There are over 100 different definitions. So very quickly, this correspondence theory runs into a whole host of problems. The same word might have many different meanings. Some words do not reference anything in the world, like prepositions. So how do we name something that transcends language or human experience? Thinking along these lines, the North African theologian St. Augustine asks, what are we referring to when we say the word nothing? The noun nothing is a referent that is by definition empty of content. We have words like unspeakable, indescribable, unnameable, words that are inherently contradictory. For the very purpose of language is to describe and name. So Augustine goes so far as to suggest that maybe the word God is like the word nothing. maybe it completely slips through our grasp and auto-deconstructs and fails to say what it is we are trying to say. Immanuel Kant, for his part, noted the epistemological problems in describing God. Kant maintained that space and time are the necessary conditions for all human perception and for us to make any judgments at all. But if this is true, and if God is outside of space and time, as is classically argued, then what are we even talking about when we use the word God? Is Anselm conceptualizing anything when he says God is that which nothing greater can be conceived? As Kant puts it in his Critique of Pure Reason, we have all the conditions of the understanding entirely against us when it comes to trying to conceive of God. While many philosophers in this tradition could be named, there is perhaps no one more influential than the 12th century Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides. Maimonides was on a quest to try to harmonize Judaism with Greek philosophy. Equipped with a command from Exodus to not make yourself an idol of any kind, of an image of anything in the heavens on one hand, and the abstract formulations of the divine from the Greeks on the other, Maimonides set out to establish a method that encouraged a philosophical interpretation of God that eliminated anthropomorphic conceptions of God. This method, often called negative theology, maintains that all religious language is simply metaphor, and metaphors are always inaccurate. Hence, the safest way to speak about God, if we are going to try to avoid any idolatrous conceptions, is to describe God solely by what God is not. Maimonides provides us a guide for how not to speak about God. Indeed, at one point in his Guide of the Perplexed, Maimonides suggests that since language so dismally fails us in describing the indescribable, that maybe our best option is simply silence. For Maimonides, God is neither wrathful nor merciful, for these terms are human categories that assume a human body, human intent, human temporality, and human emotions. God does not literally hear our prayers, for God does not have ears, and nor does God speak in human languages. Feminist philosophers, who are clued into the way we have been conditioned to imagine God through the cultural lens of patriarchy, have taken Maimonides' thought a further step to insist that God is neither male nor female, but transcends gender and sexuality. We may put it even more provocatively to say that God is trans. There is something profound and challenging about negative theology. There's also something atheistic about this approach. Maimonides would agree with Feuerbach that anthropomorphic images of God are idolatry. They are projections. If you were to give both Feuerbach and Maimonides, a Jewish thinker, a blank sheet of paper and tell them to draw a picture of God, what you would get in return is the same, a blank sheet of paper. In negative theology, there's a kind of atheism that is considered necessary for cultivating a healthy and mature faith. In the end, negative theology intends to humble us. Who are we to think that we could domesticate God or have an exhaustive account of the divine? God, rather, is precisely what ruptures or resists our depictions of the divine. This is why the 14th century German mystic Meister Eckhart said, "I pray God to rid me of God." Hence, one way religious traditions have sought to preserve the ineffability of God is to offer a seemingly endless description or names of God. In Islam, there are 99 names or attributes assigned to God, some of which appear completely contradictory to one another, stressing the fact that no one name or word can adequately do justice. Of course, negative theology also has some drawbacks. Some have pointed out that it is so abstract and so over-prioritizes right ideas that the more practical, embodied aspects of religious life, such as caring for one's neighbor or religious rituals, are deemed irrelevant. Hence, negative theology, like other traditional approaches, falls prey to a dualism that privileges intellectual contemplation while downplaying our lived experience. Others have simply pointed out how impractical it would be to try to maintain negative theology. I just try to imagine going to a worship service and hearing a song based in negative theology. Oh God, you are not ugly. Oh God, you are not stupid. Would probably not get much traction. A third possibility that tries to resolve some of these tensions between God as a super being and God as beyond being are various iterations that imagine God as intertwined with reality itself. These approaches resist the abstract aspects of negative theology while maintaining its critique of superficial and literalist depictions of God. For example, the 20th century theologian Paul Tillich speaks of God not as a being, but as the ground of being. God is not out there somewhere, but is encountered in the here and now, in the everyday stuff of life. Like Augustine or Maimonides, Tillich rejects literalist depictions of God and opts for the symbolic. But he stresses that the symbolic is both necessary and more powerful than literal speech. For Tillich, faith then is not just mere intellectual contemplation of God, but is existentially understood as ultimate concern. God is whatever gives you meaning. God is whatever you'd be willing to live or die for. For example, breath might serve as a powerful symbol of the divine. In both Hebrew and in Greek, the word breath, ruach or pneuma, are the same words used for spirit or Spirit of God or Holy Spirit. As Paul puts it in Acts 17, while quoting a famous pagan hymn to Zeus, it is in God, in him, in whom we live and move and have our being, end quote. We find this sentiment throughout Eastern religions where enlightenment is achieved when you realize that Atman is Brahman, when your reality is one and the same with ultimate reality. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh suggested that we enter into the kingdom of God every time we still ourselves and become conscious of our breath. Another example of this broad bucket of God as ground is known as process thought, founded by Alfred North Whitehead. Classical theology conceptualized God as timeless, unchanging, sovereign, impassible, bodiless. Process thinkers point out how this view of God is entirely dependent on a physics that is now rendered completely obsolete. That ancient physics conceptualized the world as static, viewed everything in a hierarchical relation to each other, and conceived of each being as having an entirely separate existence. Process thought reasons that any conception of God must be consistent and harmonizable with our understanding of the world. And what we know about the universe now is that it is expanding and evolving. It is open and dynamic and in a state of constant becoming. We know that everything in the universe is deeply interrelated. Human DNA is 98.8% identical to chimps and bonobos. The stuff that makes up your body used to be star stuff. Your body is an ecosystem that houses more microorganisms than the number of cells that make up you. All the trees in a forest are connected within 3 degrees of each other. They communicate with each other and share nutrients with each other through the mycorrhizal fungal network. As native traditions have always been saying, modern science is only now discovering the universe to be a web of complex, nonlinear, self-organizing processes that are mutually interrelated. Hence, process thought imagines God, humans, and the world not as separate substances, but as integrally connected. God is not out there, as classical dualism suggests, but is entwined with all reality. God is the name we give to the invitation to join this project of creativity and surprise, of love and openness, of relationship and open-ended interactivity. God is an invitation to an open-ended dance into the ever-expanding web of life. I find myself compelled by the work of 20th century Jewish philosophers who suggest that the word God functions as a placeholder for what happens to us in our flesh and blood encounters with another person. Hence, God is experienced both as a rupture and as an ethical responsibility. In Martin Buber's I and Thou, Buber comments how my everyday way of encountering another person is often transactional. I go to the grocery store. The clerk rings up my groceries, unless it's a machine now that just does it for me. I may say, "Good morning, how are you?" But I don't really expect the clerk to tell me how they are. But occasionally, something holy happens when I encounter another person not as an it, but as a thou, as a subject. And Buber says that God is that holy space that is created between I and thou. Similarly, the Holocaust survivor and philosopher Emmanuel Levinas sought to describe the meaning of the term God through a phenomenological description of our concrete everyday being in the world. For Levinas, God is not an object of knowledge to be mentally cognized, but always disrupts the self, the cogito, that considers itself the center of knowledge. God is not possessed as a truth, but is actualized through ethics. Levinas writes, quote, "My relation to God comes to me in the concreteness of my relation to the other human, and the sociality which is my responsibility for the neighbor," end quote. For Levinas, when I encounter the stranger, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, the refugee, the starving child, the face of the other awakens me to my responsibility to care for the other above myself. For Levinas, God is the name we give to that demand to attend to the other and deny our own egoism. It is like when Jacob remarks after being forgiven by his brother Esau in the book of Genesis, he says, "For to see your face is like seeing the face of God." It is akin to Jesus telling his disciples, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me," end quote. In stark contrast, then, to the super-being version of God, where God is described from a position of privilege and is employed to legitimize my ego, to shore up my power and defend my use of violence against the other, here God is encountered in the face of the other, who ruptures my narcissism and leaves me defenseless. Here, too, we also find an atheistic element. Levinas accepts the proverbial Nietzschean death of God, promoting what he calls a religion for adults that requires, quote, the destruction of the numinous concept of the sacred and entails the risk of atheism. For Levinas, God is not encountered in pious speech, ecstatic utterances, or in myth enthusiasm. Rather, he writes, quote, "The justice rendered to the other, my neighbor, gives me an unsurpassable proximity to God," end quote. Here I also think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was one of a handful of Lutheran pastors who actively resisted the Nazis. In Bonhoeffer's letters and papers from prison, as he awaited his death, he spoke of a religionless Christianity that resonates with both Tillich and Levinas. Bonhoeffer had observed the extreme length to which Christian nationalism in Germany had intertwined itself with fascism, with eugenics, with nativism, with anti-Semitism. He watched how all around him, his fellow Lutherans would speak religious platitudes on Sunday and then complacently accept fascism throughout the week. It occurred to Bonhoeffer, while sitting imprisoned among other political dissidents, among atheists, communists, and socialists, that his ultimate concern was more deeply aligned with theirs than with Lutheran Christians. In a world come of age, Bonhoeffer writes, we can no longer accept a God of the gaps that simply functions to fill in what science has yet to answer. Bonhoeffer asked himself, quote, "In what way are we religionless, secular Christians, not regarding ourselves from a religious point of view as specially favored, but rather as belonging wholly to the world," end quote. Bonhoeffer takes Jesus' crucifixion seriously both as a death of God and as an invitation into a particular kenotic way of being in the world. He concludes, quote, "We have to live in the world as if God does not exist. God would have us know that we must live as men who manage our lives without him. To be a Christian does not mean to be religious in a particular way, but to be a human. It is not the religious act that makes the Christian, but the participation in the sufferings of God in the secular life," end quote. For Bonhoeffer, this enacting of the sufferings of God, for it meant willingly disobeying an unjust government. It meant being willing to provide funding for Jews to escape Germany, and even partaking in an assassination plot against Hitler, despite Bonhoeffer being a pacifist. This dramatic shift in his thinking was in large part influenced by his encounter with the Black church in Harlem while he did a postdoc at Union Theological Seminary in 1930 to 1931. There he met Black civil rights activists who articulated an entirely different Christianity than the thoroughly intellectual version he had been raised with. Much like the liberation theologies of James Cone or Gustavo Gutierrez, as Bonhoeffer put it, God does not come about in a position of power and privilege, but, quote, from below, from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed, the reviled, end quote. God does not reside in the halls of political power, but rather the infant born among shepherds and the God crucified as a traitor to the Roman Empire is encountered wherever human suffering persists, and we immerse ourselves in that suffering and seek to alleviate it. There's one final shift in conceptualizing God that I want to offer, one that has been developed in our postmodern situation. Drawing from Jacques Derrida and Emmanuel Levinas, philosopher of religion John Caputo offers an even more atheistic conception of God. For Caputo, God doesn't exist, God insists. In other words, when we use the word God, we mean to name not a thing, but an event. Not a noun, but a verb. Not a being, but an invitation. God is the name we give to that more than, that surplus that we experience in our everyday reality that compels and solicits us on to greater love, justice, and hospitality. I find the concept of a pure democracy as a helpful way of working through this account of God. On paper, at least as children, we are taught that America is a democracy and has been since 1776. But was the America of 1776 fully a democracy? Women could not vote. Black people were not recognized as citizens. So no, it was not fully a democracy. Even after the 13th through 15th Amendments were passed, it was still not a pure democracy. Did America become a pure democracy after the Civil Rights Act of 1964? No. Even then, it was still entirely legal to discriminate against people with disabilities, against Native American religious practices, and the unique racism that Black women face was not recognized. And for a whole host of reasons, America is arguably still not a pure democracy today. For all we know, achieving a pure democracy is impossible, for we've never encountered such a thing. A pure democracy does not exist, and yet, democracy insists. We are continually solicited into the future toward better forms of democracy, even if we have no idea where that will take us. Caputo explores the insistence of God by analyzing the experience of gift giving. So if a friend of yours gives you a gift, immediately what happens in your body? How do you feel? What do you think? Perhaps you feel guilty or indebted. Perhaps you think, oh God, did I forget their birthday? Or maybe you think, I wonder how much this gift cost. I need to make sure I give them a gift with the same amount in return. Or immediately you write a thank you card in order to express your appreciation. I once received a thank you card for a thank you card. Or maybe some of you are parents and grandparents and you can recall a time in which you gave your kids or grandkids some cash and said it was a gift, but then you got mad when they used it to pay for something that you didn't want them to get. In all of those cases, that was not really a gift. That was just an economic exchange. If you give a friend a $10 gift card because they gave you a $10 gift card, that's just a trade. It's a transaction. From this, Caputo observes an internal tension, a paradox in the very process of gift giving. There's nothing necessarily wrong with the logic of exchange. If your company makes a product, you expect a customer to pay for it. If you work hard, you expect your employer to pay you. Friendships tend to die if they're entirely one-sided. The rules and expectations of the logic of exchange structure our lives, and yet there is always a more than to our lives in this logic of exchange. Gift-giving both threatens the rules of exchange and threatens to be reduced to those rules. Gift-giving disrupts the rules of exchange, and yet all the while the notion of a free, radical, and pure gift is never truly achieved. A pure gift doesn't exist, but it insists. Forgiveness is one of these instances where we experience the insistence of the gift. One of my favorite scenes in this regard is in Les Miserables, when Jean Valjean has just been released after spending 19 years in prison for stealing a loaf of bread for his hungry sister's children. Valjean soon finds himself the recipient of the gift of hospitality, being granted a stay in the home of Bishop Muriel. Valjean, penniless and homeless, steals Muriel's silverware in the middle of the night and runs off. The next day, the police arrest Valjean and bring him back to Muriel's house to confirm the silverware is his. To which Muriel responds, so good, "I'm so glad you've returned. You forgot the candlesticks." The logic of exchange says that those who commit a crime deserve justice, and that's true. And yet, there remains the possibility of radical hospitality, of a radical forgiveness that thwarts the reciprocal exchange of an eye for an eye. Such radical hospitality may never be achieved, yet it still insists. I imagine most of us are familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan. We all like to imagine ourselves as the hero of the story, who helps the person in need. And yet, every single one of us has seen a person stranded on the side of the highway and has driven on by. I broke my collarbone riding my bicycle last year and was lying on the side of the road, and the first car slowed down and just drove on by. Right? Every single one of us has encountered a homeless person on the sidewalk, and we have averted our eyes. Every single one of us has scrolled past a news story about a person starving in Gaza or Congo or Sudan, and we have just gone on with our lives. I ask my students why they don't stop and help people on the side of the road. They say, "I don't know what that person might do to me. I don't want to get in a precarious situation, especially if it's at night. I'm a woman, and if that stranded person is a man, no way. It's dangerous. There's no way I could help everyone who is in need." These are sensible reasons. There is nothing wrong with making sure you are safe. The logic of self-preservation is rational. And yet, as Levinas observes, the very fact that you avert your eyes, that guilt you feel, reveals how you are always already responsible for the other. So you could do the irrational. You could stop and offer aid. It is an act that disrupts the logic of self-preservation, an act that cannot be reduced to a rule, but rather breaks through the cracks of the law. That vision of radical aid may not ever be fully achievable. It may not exist, but it insists. Perhaps that's what we mean when we say the word God. Now, where does all this philosophical speculation leave us? I return to the initial questions. Why does it matter how we describe God? What do our descriptions of God say about ourselves as humans? Speaking personally, some of these approaches to naming and describing God are more persuasive and philosophically satisfying to me. I find process thought particularly compelling in its rejection of anthropomorphic and anthropocentric salvation narratives, and how it articulates an intertwined web of creation where every octopus, every tree, every lichen, every star, and every quark is also invited into the infinite dance and creativity of God. And because scientific discoveries in the problem of evil have made me rather skeptical of the notion of an all-powerful, miracle-wielding sovereign being, I am deeply moved by Levinasian and Derridian concepts of God, where is our responsibility to bring God into the world by doing justice and loving mercy. I find myself cautious, however, in drawing these conclusions, for privileging conceptions of God that I find to be the most philosophically robust has the potential danger of elitism, of fostering an arrogance and viewing my academically minded approach as superior to others. Furthermore, I am reminded of how Western Christianity's dualism has uniquely reduced faith to mental assent to a list of dogmas, doctrines, and creeds, so that belief has come to be reduced to getting the right answers on a test. Yet other religious traditions are far less interested in having certainty over the right answers, but rather emphasize praxis. They're centered around community, rituals, storytelling, and ethics, where faith is not merely right thinking, but is defined as cultivating an authentic, sincere, and faithful, embodied way of being in the world. I've come to think of our beliefs and practices as mutually reinforcing, and hence, rather than establishing a theological purity test, I'm much more interested about what our appeals to God accomplish, of what our ways of naming God do in the world, and of whether they allow us to imagine the world otherwise than it is. For me, then, the more important question is, what are our symbolic depictions of God intending to accomplish? Are they ultimately life-affirming, or are they life-denying? Do our depictions of God seek to reinforce our power and privilege, or do they function as a means to demand justice to the most vulnerable of the world? Do our depictions of God simply serve as ways to rationalize our complacency, or do they challenge us toward a greater vision of love for our neighbors, of what Martin Luther King envisioned as the beloved community? Recall the example of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, where God is depicted as an old white man in the sky. Just Google the word God or Jesus, and 99% of the images you'll get in that search depict God as a white European man. Our constant exposure to such images have a way of implicitly habituating us into simply accepting the imperialist systems of subjugation, of patriarchy and white supremacy, as expecting these as normative. In contrast, in her artwork entitled The Creation of God, Harmonia Rosales subverts Michelangelo's image and depicts God as a black woman. Now, following Maimonides, any depiction of God is ultimately inaccurate if we take it literally. However, keeping Tillich in mind, such a depiction of God might have incredibly transformative power as a symbol. On one level, visual depictions of God distort the image of God, but symbolically, they might be rich with theological meaning. Depicting God as a black woman suggests that God is among those society seeks to marginalize. It seeks to ascribe humanity to a people who have long been dehumanized and treated as second class. Depicting God as a black woman functions to subversively undermine the hierarchical systems of white supremacy and patriarchy. I think along similar lines when considering the attributes of God, such as God's mercy, on the one hand, or wrath or justice on the other. Many of us only want to talk about a God of love and forgiveness, and we really squirm when we think about a God of judgment. I do. But I wonder how much this reflects a position of privilege. Where constantly emphasizing love and forgiveness might actually be upholding and perpetuating systems of injustice. For example, in Albert Radito's book, Slave Religion, he recounts how it was extremely common for white enslavers in the 1800s to perform deathbed confessions. These white people would rape and beat black slaves their entire careers, and when they were dying, they would call their enslaved black people into the room and ask for forgiveness. And many of those enslaved black people refused. For in a world built on social hierarchies, whether that's white supremacy or misogyny or class, those in power, like me, those who abuse their power, are often given the benefit of the doubt, granted forgiveness, and given a second chance. But for those enslaved black people who had never been given a chance at all, their suffering could only have a meaning if there was a God who ultimately righted the wrongs of racial capitalism and cared about their injustice. Our positionality matters when we do theology and philosophy, and embracing the tension between the justice and mercy of God might be one possible way to assess whether we are employing our power and privilege to construct a God that affirms our own sense of superiority or allows us to avoid accountability for our complicity in injustice. The language of God is always political. It has been long tied to upholding systems of empire, of maintaining the status quo, of justifying violence against the other. This has been the language of white American Christianity, from the doctrine of discovery to City on a Hill to Manifest Destiny to the last best hope of man on earth to January 6th. Such abuses of God language provide ample justification for the elimination of religious language from the public square in its entirety. However, I'd like to make the case for what Walter Brueggemann calls the prophetic imagination. For while God talk has often functioned to reflect social values and reinforce systems of domination, there has always been a prophetic tradition that has utilized religious language as a means of imagining the world otherwise and as a tool for liberation. When the prophets of the Bible speak of the wrath of God, it is always against the rich and powerful for their acts of exploitation against the poor and oppressed. The prophets dared to dream of a world, an alternative reality where justice flows like a river. When Mary is told that she will give birth to a child named Jesus, she interprets this as a prophetic critique against empire, and she sings a song where she sings of a God, quote, who has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but has sent the rich away empty, end quote. Indeed, music is often the means by which the prophetic imagination is subversively unfurled against the systems of empire. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. Liberation for the oppressed, as Jesus says in Luke 4, is good news. It is the gospel. The task before us then, I believe, is not an abandonment of God talk, but an invitation to courageous creativity in which we develop new metaphors, write new songs, and perhaps retrofit old prophetic visions of God for our current precarious situation. These new symbols and descriptions may not be universally applicable for all circumstances, and certainly are not a quick fix solution. However, I hold out hope that insightfully employing God talk may function as an invaluable resource for the task of imagining and developing a new creation in which we are all free. For as the Christian prophet Fannie Lou Hamer put it, no one is free until everyone is free. Thank you.